Nice. Yeah.
So, thank you. I wanted to talk just a little bit as a sort of perhaps a way to open the discussion about the response, to begin with, of the Iranian left and different Iranian political formations who are broadly seeking progressive change in Iran and how they've responded to what's happened in Syria, and then sort of use that as a bit of a platform to maybe talk about kind of internationally a bit more what's going on the left. And this peculiar phenomenon that Mark pointed to, where we have people in, if you like, the left-wing groups around the world who have the same line on Syria as Boris Johnson, and sort of how this came to be. So I think the story of looking at it from Iran really begins to make sense if you look at the response in Iran. There's like a story of a changing response in Iran from the initial response to the Arab Spring, and then following the years when the slide of the Syrian situation into war and so on. So when the Arab Spring started, amongst the same social layers that were very active in the Iranian Green movement, so students, national minorities, women, and to a lesser extent some a small reborn trade union movement, you got a very, very excited and a very kind of passionate response to this. So people were very playfully organising demonstrations in Tehran that played with the slogans that were being chanted in the rest of the region. So one of the big slogans became, whether Tehran or whether Cairo, the dictators all have to go, and sort of stuff like this. And like, you know, it's your turn next, Ahmadinejad, and this kind of business. But sort of the response of the regime to that within Iran was sort of twofold, really. The first part of its response was to kind of crack down on the beginnings of that dissent and stuff. And the second part, especially over the last few years of the Rouhani administration, in terms of how it's sort of shifted the discourse around Syria, is like Mark was talking about, really sort of begun to sort of push the same narrative of this conflict in Syria being entirely about crazy religious fanatics and the Iranian regime being the voice of reason in the area. And one of the things that's achieved is that the natural constituency of the kind of actors in Iranian politics who we might have hoped would have been the people who would, if you like, engage with dissent around, you know, effectively Iranian imperialist intervention in Syria, has a number of those different social layers and groups have ended up lining up behind the regime. So quite an interesting an example of that is like within Iran, the dissident layers we can talk about are the Green Movement, the remnants of pre-79 groups like the National Religious Movement and the left and so on, and sort of dissidents like liberal dissidents outside the country with links to Western powers and so on. And in each case, there's been a response to Syria which isn't critical really of the regime's role there, which is why you can tell that narrative is being successful. So to give an example of how successful it's been, obviously in terms of the like in a country where there's not necessarily political freedom and stuff like that, cultural output is a very good barometer of where people are, isn't it? And so the Fajr Film Festival in Tehran, around the time of the Green Movement and then the Arab Spring, you had people, these kind of big, like, you know, progressive film directors and artists refusing to collect their awards because of what they perceived as the crackdown of the regime on democracy and so on. Whereas just this year, there was a number of, there was 2 directors who dedicated the awards they got to our boys who were fighting terrorism in Syria. Which I think it tells you quite how successful the regime's been in terms of spreading that narrative. Yeah, you bear with me a second. And yeah, that what's really becomes tragic is when, because of the question of the Iranian reformism and that part of the agenda of Iranian reformists being, if you like, bringing Iran in from the cold internationally, you get this double-bind tragedy of groups like, even ostensibly quite radical groups seeking social change in the country, like some of the Green Movement groups. You get them seeing this mainly as an opportunity, the question of Syria, as an opportunity to find a way of sort of moving closer to the West by claiming that Iran is doing the job of fighting terror in the region. If we move on a little bit to the, if you like, the response of the Iranian left in the in the sense of the left groups, there's a couple of things that really needs to be said. Which in the first case, since 1979 and the prison massacres in the 80s and so on, there's been a new generation of leftist activists in Iran that arise at two moments. First of all, after the student uprising in the early part of this century, and a number of students came out of that movement, and then later on there's been, since 2004, there's been a kind of upturn in independent trade union organising, especially around bus drivers in Tehran, sugar workers in the southwest, and a number of different oil workers in the south and so on. The response of the Iranian left, like in terms of that movement, the students and the trade unionists, is the first thing we need to remember about is, just like the British left, it's actually not the biggest player in terms of radical social movements. And secondly, like that's a left that, like people from a lot of countries, carries a certain baggage and a chauvinism of its own. And so there's a tendency to look around, like in Egypt or in Syria, and see the social forces at play there as being in some sense a repeat of what happened in Iran in 1979. And so there's a lack of getting to grips with kind of the new sociology that's at play in the region. So because these people are leftists, you remember what happened to leftists after the 79 revolution in Iran, you put two and two together and see where that ends up. And interestingly, like, you know, we talked a lot on the internet and whatnot, and we sometimes see this phrase that people throw around and say, oh, the British left is so shit, blah blah blah, and it is, yeah. But like, I'm not going to stand up here and say it ain't. But the thing is, I think the problem with that phrase, the British left or the Western left, is when you look around the world, the rest of the world seems to be roughly as shit. It's
true.
Yeah. And so, like a lot of the problems that we see in terms of people relating to those struggles, I think are similar when we look at Iran or in other countries. Like looking in the rest of the region, you can actually see this trend of kind of people failing to get to grips with, or refusing to get to grips with, revolutions that don't look like the revolutions they want to come along. And as a result of that, down that pathway lies madness, basically. So you can think of, like, for instance, the Awami Workers' Party in Pakistan, who seem to be pushing more and more, like in terms of the basically the war that's going on between the so-called Taliban groups and the army. The AWP's sort of line on that, the criticism of the Pakistani government is the army don't go in hard enough. You know, they're not hard enough with these liberals who don't support our boys properly. And you know, you can see that that's where that tendency sort of takes us. And I think for me, it's also very apparent in Syria when you get from the Iranian left and the left and the rest of the region, the very different responses to the situation in Aleppo and the situation in Rojava, a couple of years ago when that was on that turning point. I remember a conversation with a comrade and friend who's a member of one of the Iranian left groups, was in the country, came out into exile and stuff, and what he was saying to me was, he'd just come back from Kurdistan, and he was saying, this is the Paris Commune of the 21st century, they're about to drown it in blood and so on, and I think it's a mark of how poorly we as a left are analysing and trying to get to grips with what's going on, that it basically looked like we called the wrong one the Paris Commune, you know? We've engaged, like, we've fallen for that trap of looking at the people whose symbols are ostensibly the most like us, who make us feel like we're kind of at home in a world we recognise, rather than taking that plunge into kind of the new way that society seems to be working. Moving on from there, I think really this is about the wrong, as I said before, the wrong kind of revolution turning up. And we've got a left internationally that's been waiting since what, do you know what I mean, call the year, man, 1945, 1917, whenever you want. Since whenever, we've been waiting for this. The industrial working class are about to arrive, they're just around the corner, any day now. And consistently this doesn't happen, and instead we end up with, you know, radicalised intelligentsia doing stuff, different social forces at work at different countries. And this if you like, wrong kind of revolution has, I think, a couple of features that I think we need to start getting to grips with. One of them, I think, is interesting when you look at, like, the green movement and the growth of that in Iran, and one of the things that the left failed to get to grips with there. There's an anecdote that's in the mysterious first chapter of this book about how the left has struggled to deal with the reality of how people, especially in the global south, I shouldn't say things like especially in the global south in SOAS, specialisms. Especially in the global south, we haven't got to grips with kind of the way people are pissed off about neoliberalism, basically. So the left, again, the left, we want people to like rise up and overthrow this neoliberal thing, but in terms of when people are actually campaigning against it and organising against it, it seems in the main to be about them wanting a bit of the good things of neoliberalism for themselves. So there's a story, as I say, we tell in the first chapter of that book, where there's a story in a book about the history of the Hezbollah, where a French filmmaker goes to Lebanon to make this documentary about the Hezbollah. And there's these Hezbollah cadres are sort of sent to mind him, in Beirut and whatnot, in the slums and everything. And they're showing him around, and he's going, I want to go to this place, I want to see this slum, I want to see that other slum. And this Hezbollah activist gets really upset, and he says, why do you want to show the world that we all live in slums? Do you know what I mean? We've done quite well, do you know what I mean? This political organisation, it's got us a place at the table, let me take you to see some like posh Shias, do you know what I mean? Some people who've made it. And again, on that kind of anecdotal tip, I have last time I was in Iran, I was speaking to one of my cousins who was complaining about Iranian cinema, as in the Iranian cinema that we see internationally, not the rubbish they put in, Megamaxes or whatever. And her point was, she was going like, I was saying, she's a big cinephile, and I was saying, we have these great film directors, man, do you know what I mean? Like, this is a good thing. And she was like, yeah, but the problem is, they only ever show the problems of our country to the rest of the world. But if you go to Tehran now, there's shopping malls where you can eat sushi, do you know what I mean? And yeah, the left has failed to get to grips with that. It's failed to get to grips with how people are relating to neoliberalism. And it's also failed to get to grips with the fact that this generation of revolution seems to be about democracy. And seems to be about kind of what, I suppose in the